There are islands that vanish from memory not because the sea swallows them, but because history itself turns away in discomfort. This one lay in the shadowed folds of Europe's maritime past, a place whose shoreline was marked less by its geography than by the stain of its reputation. Here, justice did not come with the clang of chains or the building of gibbets. Instead, it arrived with pigment, a deep, almost luminous blue that clung to the flesh like a second skin. To be painted blue on this island was not an ornament of pride, nor an echo of warrior tradition, but a sentence. It was a punishment both grotesque and calculated, a public humiliation designed to make the offender into a living warning. In the salt air and relentless sun, the hue would darken and harden, a brand more intimate than iron. The idea seems absurd to modern sensibilities, yet the more one learns of it, the more deliberate it appears. Across the world, color has always been more than color. It has been signal, shibboleth, and curse. Roman generals dyed their cloaks crimson to broadcast triumph. Medieval penitents wore yellow to proclaim their disgrace. In ancient India, saffron announced sanctity. On this island, blue meant shame. Not the sky's easy blue or the soft blue of summer water, but something harsher, closer to the bruising of the skin or the darkening of copper in rain. The pigment was mixed from ground minerals and vegetal dyes, often blended with a binding agent that made it cling for weeks, even months. Under the gaze of neighbors, there was no hiding it. How did such a practice take root? Some say it was born from old rites in which warriors painted themselves blue before battle, a practice later remembered in whispers about the painted Picts of northern Britain. Perhaps an echo of this ritual was inverted, its courage hollowed out, until the color became not a badge of honor but a mark of contempt. Others trace its origins to maritime superstition. Blue as the color of the drowned, the cursed, the lost to the depths. Whatever its genesis, by the time the first records were kept, brief, often scandalized entries in the diaries of visiting traders and sailors, the custom was already entrenched. The geography of the island helped the ritual thrive, isolated enough to foster its own codes, yet close enough to busy trade routes to be noticed. It existed in a strange tension between insularity and exposure. To be painted blue here was to be marked not only before one's own people, but also before outsiders, the punishment amplified by the possibility that word and color would travel far beyond the shoreline. Humiliation was the point, but it was also a performance. One cannot overstate the cruelty of such visibility. Stripped of anonymity, the punished walked among their accusers daily, their every gesture framed by the blue stain. Children stared. Merchants hesitated. Priests, in some accounts, would not allow the painted to approach the altar. For some, the pigment became a sentence longer than the intended term, lingering in skin folds and under nails, refusing to fade. It was an exile without leaving home, a social death enacted in the full light of day. And yet, as with all acts of punishment, there were contradictions. Some, forced into blue, carried themselves with an unexpected dignity, subverting the shame. A few even came to see the color as armor, their defiance turning the public spectacle against its authors. In rare cases, the blue became a symbol of solidarity among those who had been marked, an unintentional fellowship born of exclusion. Such complexities make the story of the island's blue justice more than a curiosity. They make it a mirror for all the ways societies weaponize identity, and all the ways the punished resist. The historical record is fragmentary, scattered across ship logs, court transcripts, and travelers' letters. There are gaps wide enough for myth to breed. This account will follow the threads that remain, the cultural roots, the mechanics of the punishment, the individuals caught in its grip, the eventual decline of the practice, and weave them into a continuous narrative. It will not be a tale of color alone, but of power, humiliation, resilience, and the strange human compulsion to make justice visible, tangible, and unforgettable. Here begins the story of the island where blue was not the color of the sky, but the color of disgrace. Long before the world came to know it as the place where wrongdoers were painted blue, the island lay shrouded in a veil of sea mist, its low hills and jagged coastline half hidden from the decks of passing ships. Fishermen spoke of it in a mixture of respect and wariness. They called it by many names, some poetic, others harsh, But to outsiders, it was a speck on maritime charts, a wind-battered outpost in the cold waters between larger, more powerful lands. Yet within its boundaries, a distinct culture flourished, shaped by isolation, the rhythms of the sea, and the iron-bound codes of its people. The island's geography was both a blessing and a prison. Encircled by treacherous shoals and unpredictable tides, it was difficult to reach without intimate local knowledge. This isolation preserved traditions that might have faded elsewhere, giving the community a fierce sense of self-identity. But it also meant that disputes, grudges, and transgressions played out in a closed arena. There were no distant cities to escape to, no anonymous crowds to vanish into. Justice, when it came, was public, immediate, and unforgettable. The first credible accounts of the blue punishment come not from the islanders themselves, whose oral traditions were rarely committed to writing, but from the journals of traders and sailors in the late medieval period. One such document, kept by a merchant from the Hanseatic League, describes a custom most strange, whereby the guilty are daubed in the hue of the seas and made to walk amongst their fellows until the shame eats at their spirit. This merchant notes, almost with morbid fascination, the skill with which the pigment was prepared, a mixture of ground stone, plant, and oil, so that it endures through rain and sun alike. What drove the islanders to adopt such a peculiar form of justice remains a matter of speculation. Some historians suggest it evolved from ancient warrior rites, where painting the skin before battle was meant to intimidate enemies and rally courage. Over time, as warfare waned and communal governance grew more rigid, the symbolic power of the color was inverted. Others point to a possible connection with maritime superstition. Blue, in many coastal cultures, was tied to drowning, to restless spirits, and to those who angered the gods of the sea. Marking someone in this color may have been akin to declaring them cursed, set apart from the community's protection. Archaeological evidence lends weight to the theory of ritual origins. Burial sites on the island contain fragments of shells and minerals that could have been used as pigment, as well as comb-like tools stained with traces of blue residue. These items date back centuries before the first written mention of the punishment, suggesting that the act of painting the body, whether for war, ritual, or disgrace, was deeply embedded in the island's culture. Life on the island was hard, and its governance was equally uncompromising. The community was ruled by a council of elders, each representing one of the coastal villages. They met in a timber hall at the island's heart, its walls darkened by decades of smoke from the central hearth. Here, disputes were settled in full view of the people. Lesser offenses, petty theft, public drunkenness, insults to authority, might result in fines, labor service, or public apology. But for crimes that struck at the moral heart of the community, betrayal, deceit, acts that disrupted the fragile trust of island life, the punishment was the blue. Those sentenced would be brought before the council, stripped to the waist or further depending on the severity of their offense, and painted slowly, methodically, by designated hands. The pigment was applied with wide brushes made from horsehair, the strokes deliberate and unhurried, allowing the gathered crowd to witness every moment. The humiliation was as much in the spectacle as in the result. Once marked, the offender was not imprisoned. Instead, they were sent back into daily life, forced to carry their disgrace in every interaction. It is tempting to dismiss such a punishment as primitive cruelty, yet in its own way, it was an efficient form of control. The island could not afford the cost of long-term imprisonment, nor could it spare the manpower to guard offenders. The blue was a prison without walls, its bars woven from shame and social exclusion. And for a people bound together by necessity, ostracism could be a punishment more feared than chains. Still, the practice carried risks. A punishment so visible invited both compliance and rebellion. Some of the earliest stories tell of individuals who bore their blue skin defiantly, refusing to cower, turning their public disgrace into a badge of resistance. Others fled the island entirely, vanishing into the broader world, where the blue faded and their identities were remade. Such cases, though rare, hinted at the limits of shame as a tool of governance, and foreshadowed the tensions that would one day challenge the practice itself. For now, in these earliest centuries, the island's blue justice stood unchallenged. To the outside world, It was a curiosity, a strange local custom. To the islanders, it was a living part of their moral code, a reminder that here, in the mist between sea and sky, one's honor was not merely a private possession but a public trust. And to lose it was to be colored by it, literally, for all to see. The pigment that transformed a person into a walking emblem of disgrace was no ordinary dye. On the island, its preparation was as ritualized as the act of punishment itself, a process guarded by a small, hereditary group known as the Tint Masters. These individuals, always drawn from a handful of coastal families, held the secret of the blue's composition, and their skill was respected, even feared. In a society where shame could be painted onto your skin for all to see, those who wielded the brush wielded power. The core ingredient was a mineral found in the island's cliffs, a soft blue-gray stone veined with streaks of deeper indigo. Known locally as sea bone, it was said to be the petrified remains of ancient ocean creatures, or, in the more superstitious tales, fragments of the drowned sky itself. When freshly quarried, the stone was pale, almost chalky, but when ground to a fine powder and mixed with certain oils, it deepened to a striking, almost unnatural blue that clung to human skin like a second layer. The Tint Masters collected the stone at low tide from a narrow strip of coastline where the cliffs met the sea in jagged teeth. It was dangerous work. The tides here rose fast, and waves could knock a man from the rocks without warning. The cliffs were treacherous, riddled with fissures, and slick with algae. This danger was part of the pigment's mystique. The raw material came at a cost, as though the sea itself demanded a toll for its gift. Once quarried, the stone was taken inland to pigment houses, low, smoke-filled buildings where mortar and pestle were put to work for hours, sometimes days. The grinding was done slowly to avoid heat, which the tint masters claimed could bruise the color and dull its brilliance. Alongside the mineral base, a variety of binders were used: fish oil for weather resistance, plant resins for adhesion, and a trace of ash from driftwood fires, said to deepen the tone. The recipe varied subtly between villages, but all shared the goal of creating a color that would endure wind, rain, and salt air for weeks without fading. What made the blue so distinctive was not only its intensity, but its permanence. Unlike common dyes, which stained the surface of the skin, this pigment seeped into the uppermost layers, resisting even the most determined attempts to scrub it away. A marked person might bathe in hot water, scrape their skin raw, or coat themselves in mud in the hopes of breaking the bond, but the color clung stubbornly until time and the body's natural shedding of skin carried it away. The act of painting was as much about symbolism as it was about visibility. The tint masters worked in silence during the application, their long-handled brushes sweeping in steady, deliberate motions. The strokes began at the crown of the head and worked downwards, an inversion of certain island blessing rites in which white clay was applied from the feet upward. In this reversal, the blessing became a curse, the color a public declaration that the person's moral standing had been overturned. The shade itself carried layers of meaning. Blue was the color of the surrounding sea, life-giving yet deadly, capable of feeding the island or swallowing it whole. It was also associated with the storms that could isolate the community for weeks, a reminder of nature's power to confine and punish. In older myths, blue marked those claimed by the sea gods. Shipwrecked sailors who returned from mere drowning with skin tinged an unnatural hue were said to have been touched, and therefore set apart. By adopting the color for punishment, the islanders tapped into this deep well of cultural memory, recasting it as a human judgment rather than a divine one. Even the drying of the pigment was ritualized. After the painting, the offender stood in a public square or along the village's main path, facing into the wind. Neighbors passed by, some spitting on the ground in disdain, others staring with unreadable expressions. The wind off the sea would dry the pigment into a matte finish, its texture slightly rough to the touch, giving the skin an almost scaled appearance. This subtle transformation heightened the sense of otherness. The painted person no longer looked entirely human. The tint masters themselves occupied a strange position in island society. They were indispensable to the justice system, yet their role set them apart. Children sometimes whispered that their hands were permanently stained beneath the nails, that they could see guilt in a person's face before any trial was held. Whether feared or respected, they were rarely crossed. A careless insult to a tint master could linger in memory until a convenient accusation brought you under their brush. Over generations, the making of the blue became a form of cultural inheritance, passed down from elder to apprentice in hushed tones. Some techniques, such as the exact ratio of mineral to oil, were never written down, existing only in the muscle memory of those who practiced them. Even in later centuries, when outsiders tried to replicate the pigment for trade or curiosity, they found that the exact shade and endurance of the island blue could not be reproduced without the local stone and the guarded process. To the islanders, this secrecy was not merely about protecting a craft. It was about guarding the power of justice itself. If anyone could make the pigment, its authority would dilute, its sting would fade. The blue was not meant for decoration or vanity. It was a mark of shame, and its creation carried the weight of the community's moral judgment. Thus, the pigment was more than a mixture of stone and oil. It was a binding agent of the island's social order, a tangible link between ancient ritual, natural danger, and communal identity. To where it was to be branded not only by the council's decree, but by the very earth and sea that sustained and judged the island's people. Long before the blue became a common sight, there was a single event that etched the punishment into the island's collective memory. The story was told in the smokehouses on long winter nights, in the lull between fishing seasons, and always with the same hushed reverence. It was the tale of Kalen, remembered as the first marked one. His name was never erased from the island's records, nor was it forgiven. Kalen had been born into one of the island's most respected fishing clans, the sort whose reputation was built on generations of safe voyages and generous catches. His father, Arion, was known for navigating by the stars with uncanny precision, and his mother was a weaver whose sails held fast even in the blackest storms. Kalen, however, carried a restlessness that no tide could anchor. From an early age, he was drawn not to the rhythm of the nets and ropes, but to the hidden coves and caves along the shoreline, places whispered to be dangerous, even cursed. The trouble began in a season when the fish failed. Nets came back empty, and the islanders grew hungry and tense. In such times, it was custom for each clan to share from their stores, a practice that kept famine at bay and ensured that no family starved. Kalen, however, saw an opportunity in the scarcity. He began hoarding the catch from his own solitary ventures into the forbidden coves, trading it in secret to passing merchant vessels in exchange for mainland goods, wine, fine cloth, and small luxuries that glittered in the lamplight of his hut. It might have gone unnoticed had he not grown careless. One night, a storm struck, and one of the merchant ships he dealt with was driven onto the rocks. Its cargo, Kalen's ill-gotten fish, spilled across the beach, and the evidence of his betrayal was plain for all to see. To withhold food in times of need was more than selfishness. It was treason against the community's survival. The council convened swiftly. Witnesses spoke of seeing Kalen's shadow slipping down to the coves at odd hours, of his hut smelling of smoked fish when the rest of the village had none. Even his own cousins testified, their faces pale with shame. Kalen, for his part, refused to confess, insisting the council had no right to demand his personal catch. But on the island, survival was not personal, it was shared. The verdict was unanimous. He would be the first to wear the blue. No one knew exactly what to expect, for the punishment had been proposed in theory, but never enacted. The tint masters prepared the pigment in near silence, grinding the sea bone into the purest, deepest hue they could achieve. On the day of the marking, Kalen was brought to the village square, bound at the wrists. The sky was a hard, cold gray, and the wind carried the salt sting of an incoming tide. As the first brushstroke touched his forehead, a murmur passed through the crowd. The color was shocking in its vividness. Darker than the open sea, yet with a strange, luminous undertone that seemed to drink in the light. The brush moved slowly, deliberately, tracing lines down his face, across his neck, and over his chest. Each stroke was an unspoken accusation. You put yourself before the many. The blue clung to his skin, drying into a texture like weathered stone, transforming his features into something at once human and alien. When the tint masters stepped back, Kalen was no longer simply Kalen. He was the embodiment of betrayal. The council ordered him to stand at the central path until the sun dipped into the sea, forcing every passerby to look upon him. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed. Old men spat into the dirt. Some villagers avoided his gaze entirely, afraid the stain of his crime might pass to them through eye contact alone. The punishment was not exile, not physically, but in every way that mattered. Kalen was cut off. No one traded with him. No one shared a fire with him. Even his family kept their distance, speaking only when necessary. The blue did its work more effectively than walls or chains. It announced his guilt to every eye, every hour of the day. And it lasted. Days turned to weeks, and the color barely faded. Kalen tried scrubbing with sand, bathing in the icy shallows, even covering himself in mud to dull the hue. Nothing worked. The pigment held like a curse. As the weeks passed, he grew thinner. His fine cloth and stolen wine became useless in a society that no longer acknowledged him. Eventually, he left the village, vanishing into the island's wind-scoured cliffs. Some claimed to see him, months later, moving along the horizon like a blue phantom. Others said he drowned himself, letting the sea reclaim him as payment for his crimes. No one knew for certain, but his story became the cautionary tale that cemented the punishment in law. From that day forward, the blue was more than a threat. It was a promise, one the island kept. Kalen's fate was invoked whenever someone was tempted to place their own gain above the community's needs. The sea might feed you, the elders would say, but the blue would strip you bare. In the seasons that followed Kalen's marking, the island underwent a subtle but profound shift. What had once been an untested theory of justice now stood as an undeniable reality. A punishment whose power was not only in its permanence, but in the way it rewrote the very fabric of social order. The council saw this, and like all governing bodies throughout history, they recognized an opportunity. At first, the blue was used sparingly, reserved for the gravest of offenses: theft during famine, sabotage of fishing gear, and acts that directly endangered the survival of the community. But it did not take long for the scope to widen. The elders discovered that the punishment, when wielded carefully, could enforce more than just survival. It could enforce obedience. The transformation began with quiet cases, those that could be easily justified. A fisherman who refused to contribute his share of the catch during a festival was accused of dishonoring tradition and was painted. A stonemason who publicly questioned the council's distribution of resources was marked for sowing discord. Each case blurred the line between genuine wrongdoing and defiance of authority. The blue became more than a sign of guilt. It was a brand of the council's will. And as with all such tools, its power lay not only in its application, but in the fear of its application. Stories began to circulate of people being marked not for clear crimes, but for crossing invisible lines, speaking too boldly, standing too firmly against the wrong elder, refusing a marriage arrangement deemed for the good of the village. The accused could protest, but the judgment was swift. Once the decision was made, the pigment was mixed, the brush dipped, and the transformation began. The ceremony itself took on an almost ritualistic gravity. Whereas Kalen's punishment had been stark and unadorned, later proceedings added formal elements meant to remind the people that the act was not merely punitive but sacred. The tint masters began chanting an incantation, half warning, half prayer, while applying the pigment. They worked in public squares, never in private, ensuring the humiliation was complete. The marked were forced to stand for hours after the painting, their bodies drying under the eyes of the crowd, the blue deepening to its final shade, as if the stain itself was hardening into the truth of their guilt. Children were taught rhymes about the blue, songs that carried warnings in sing-song voices. Blue skin, black sin. Keep your hands clean or they'll paint you in. These verses embedded the fear into the minds of the next generation before they were even old enough to understand the full consequences. Over time, the punishment began to serve a second, quieter function. It became a signal to the mainlanders who occasionally visited. Traders, who once judged islanders by the strength of their boats or the richness of their catch, now looked first at a man's skin. A single mark of blue, no matter how faded, was enough to make outsiders wary, even hostile. This extended the exile beyond the island itself. Once painted, a person could not escape the shame by leaving. In this way, the blue was a sentence with no borders. Yet, in their eagerness to wield this power, the council overlooked a growing consequence. The more they used the blue, the more they fed an undercurrent of resentment among the people. Families of the marked began whispering among themselves, seeking solidarity in shared disgrace. Secret gatherings emerged in the caves Kalen had once frequented, where those touched by the pigment and their kin met to speak freely away from the council's ear. They did not yet have the strength to defy openly, but the seeds were there. In these hidden meetings, a new idea began to take root. Perhaps the blue could be turned from a mark of shame into a badge of identity. Perhaps what was meant to divide could be used to unite. The council knew nothing of this yet, but they had already lost control of the narrative in ways they could not foresee. By the end of the decade, more than 24 islanders had been painted. Some bore the pigment for life, its permanence resisting all attempts at removal. Others saw it fade after many years, but the social stain remained. The law was now firmly established. To be painted was to be condemned, and to be condemned was to live apart. The blue had become an instrument of power, its original purpose warped, its reach extended far beyond the hunger and betrayal that had first birthed it. What began with a single man's greed had evolved into an unspoken pact between the rulers and the ruled. So long as you bowed your head, you were safe. But defiance, whether in action or in thought, could bring the brush to your skin. And once it touched you, it never truly let go. By the time a generation had passed since Kalen's marking, the blue punishment was as much a part of island life as the tides. No child born on the island had ever known a world without it. The brush and pigment jar sat in a wooden case at the center of the council hall, locked with an iron clasp, but its presence was felt everywhere. For most, this was enough to keep them in line. But for one woman, it was not fear that defined her, only fury. Her name was Mara, a fisher's daughter born in the village of Turo's Bend, where the coast curled into a shallow crescent and the water shimmered green, even in winter. From childhood, Mara had been outspoken, unwilling to let the council's words pass without challenge. She worked the fishing boats alongside her brothers, but unlike them, she never lowered her eyes in the presence of authority. In time, she married a stonemason named Darren, a man known for his skill with building walls that could resist the fierce sea winds. Their union was not arranged by the council. It was a matter of choice, and that alone had marked her as willful in the eyes of the elders. Darren was a quiet man, but he shared his wife's unwillingness to bend to injustice. When the council decreed that all new houses must be taxed in stone to build a ceremonial wall along the square, a wall that served no purpose other than to display the wealth of the ruling families, Darren refused. Stone is for shelter, not for vanity, he told the elder who came to collect. The refusal was small, but on an island where defiance was watched like a disease, it was enough to set the gears in motion. The council's judgment was swift. They accused Darren of withholding resources vital to the unity of the community, a crime dressed in moral language but rooted in punishment for disobedience. Before the week's end, the tent masters were summoned, but Mara would not allow her husband to be humiliated alone. On the day of the painting, she stood beside him in the square, her voice cutting through the chants of the ceremony. She accused the council of twisting the blue punishment from a tool of justice into a weapon for crushing dissent. She reminded the crowd of Kalen, of famine, of the punishment's original purpose, and how far they had strayed from it. Some in the crowd averted their eyes, fearing to be seen agreeing. Others listened, their jaws tight. The tint masters ignored her, dipping their brushes in the pigment and painting Darren's arms in slow, deliberate strokes. The blue soaked into his skin like ink into parchment, the crowd holding its collective breath. But then Mara did the unthinkable. She seized the jar from the tint master's hand and, before anyone could stop her, smeared the pigment across her own face. Gasps echoed through the square. The act was unprecedented. The blue was meant to be applied by authority, not claimed by the accused. Mara's hands trembled, but her voice was steady as she declared, "If standing against corruption is a crime, then I am guilty." The elders were furious. They ordered her seized, but Mara did not resist. She stood tall, the blue already drying against her skin, the sun catching the pigments until they seemed to burn. The moment shattered the silent contract that had kept the people in submission. By claiming the punishment as her own, Mera had stolen the council's monopoly on its meaning. The days that followed were tense. Darren and Mera were banished to the outskirts, forced to live beyond the main village near the abandoned watchtower on the cliffs. But something unexpected happened. People began visiting them in secret. Fishermen brought extra catch, stonemasons offered tools, and, most dangerously, some came not out of pity, but to speak. They talked of unfair taxes, of land disputes decided only in favor of the powerful, of cousins and siblings marked blue for reasons that had little to do with crime. Mera listened, her quiet defiance growing into something more organized. She began painting small strips of cloth with the same pigment, worn under clothing or tied to a wrist, so that those who shared her cause could recognize each other without exposing themselves to danger. It was a silent rebellion, but it was rebellion nonetheless. The council, of course, heard whispers. They debated harsher measures, but each proposal carried risk. To mark more people blue might turn the pigment from a stigma into a symbol of solidarity. To ignore Mera might allow her to gather more followers. For the first time since the ritual's creation, the rulers of the island were uncertain. And somewhere in the heart of that uncertainty, in the shadow of the cliffs where Mera's small hut stood, a new truth was taking shape. The blue no longer belonged solely to those who wielded the brush. It could be claimed, twisted, and redefined, not by decree, but by those willing to bear it without shame. In the weeks after Mera's defiance, the island's rhythm shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. The tides still came and went, the fishing boats still set out before dawn, and the market still opened at first light. But beneath that surface order ran a current of quiet rebellion. It began in whispers exchanged over baskets of mackerel, in glances passed between neighbors as they fetched water from the communal well. The pigment that once symbolized shame had begun, ever so slightly, to lose its sting. Mera and Darren remained in their banishment by the cliffside watchtower. The wind there was harsher, salted air scouring the stone until it crumbled in places, but their exile gave them freedom from the constant gaze of the council's guards. Those who dared to visit came under cover of darkness, their steps muffled in the grass. They brought scraps of linen, bits of thread, and jars of pigment stolen from stores or traded through dangerous channels. Mera worked tirelessly, dyeing the cloth strips with the unmistakable cobalt hue. To her, each one was a seed, small, fragile, but carrying the potential to grow into something larger. Wearing the cloth was an act of calculated risk. It was hidden under sleeves, woven into hair, or tied around ankles where it would be unseen. But some were bolder. A young boy in the southern hamlet wove his into the handle of his fishing net. A midwife in the west tied one openly around her waist, claiming it was a charm against sickness. In truth, it was a statement, and those who knew, knew. The council did not remain blind to these changes. At first, they dismissed them as harmless mimicry, but as more people began to adopt the blue in subtle ways, their unease grew. A meeting was called in the stone hall, torches flickering along the walls. Elder Bran, whose family had been part of the original punishment's creation, slammed his palm against the table. "This is a contagion," he declared. "If we allow the blue to become a badge instead of a brand, we lose our authority." Others argued for a swift crackdown, more patrols in the villages, random inspections for hidden cloths, public punishments for those caught misusing the pigment. But there was a problem none of them could ignore. Too many of the offenders were the children, spouses, or cousins of the island's own guards and merchants. Too many well-respected families were quietly part of this. To strip the blue from them by force, or worse, to mark them officially, would expose the fragility of the council's power. Meanwhile, Mera's influence grew not just through the cloths, but through stories. Children began to play a new game in the alleys, pretending to be Mera and the elders. One child would paint themselves with mud or crushed berries and stand proudly, while the others played the part of a sputtering council too slow to stop her. The elders tried to forbid the game, but the more they forbade it, the more it spread. The shift was most visible in the marketplace. Before, a blue-marked person walking through the square would have been met with turned backs and hushed insults. Now, the reaction was different. Some merchants handed them bread without charge. Fishermen nodded as they passed. A group of young women, seeing a man marked blue for stealing a goat, smiled at him instead of spitting. The shame that once clung to the pigment was loosening, replaced by a dangerous thing: empathy. The first true test came when the council ordered the painting of a farmer named Oric, accused of shorting the grain tithe. He was a broad-shouldered man with a quiet manner, but well-liked. On the morning of his punishment, the square filled as it always did. But this time, something unprecedented happened. Dozens in the crowd wore bits of blue cloth openly, their faces calm but unyielding. The tint masters hesitated, brushes poised, unsure if they were about to spark something irreversible. The elders ordered the ceremony to continue, and Oric was painted. But as he walked back through the crowd, the people parted for him as if he were a hero returning from battle. Someone slipped a strip of cloth into his hand. A woman kissed his cheek. To the council watching from their dais, the meaning was clear. The punishment no longer worked as intended. Mara heard about the event that night from a fisherman's wife who ran the long path to the cliffs in the dark. The woman was breathless, eyes bright with something between fear and joy. "It's happening," she told Mara. "They're not afraid anymore." But Mara, for all her defiance, understood what this meant. The council would not simply watch their authority erode, they would act. And when they did, it would not be with pigment and brushes. The next move would be sharper, more dangerous. The island, once united by its silent compliance, was now dividing into two colors: those who feared the blue and those who wore it willingly. And the space between them was shrinking with each passing tide. The elders did not sleep well in the days after Oric's punishment. Their authority, once as steady as the tides, now felt like sand shifting beneath their feet. In the dim torchlight of the council hall, faces once smug with control were tight with worry. Elder Bran, his voice edged with fury, spoke first. "We are losing them. If the blue no longer shames, then it is nothing but a color. And a color cannot keep order." Some suggested increasing the severity of the charges, painting and imprisonment combined, public whippings alongside the pigment. But others cautioned that too much cruelty might drive the people past fear and into open revolt. Elder Harith, the most calculating among them, proposed a different approach. "If we cannot stop the color from spreading, then we will poison its meaning. Make it a mark no one wants to share." Thus began the Deep Mark Decree. Any person painted blue would now be forced to wear a thick band of pigment around the eyes and mouth, a mask-like stain that lingered for months no matter how much it was scrubbed. It gave the punished a hollow, almost inhuman appearance, eyes stark and ringed, lips ghostly against the cobalt. Worse, the council ordered that these deep-marked be given the most degrading of public labors: cleaning waste from the streets, scrubbing fish guts from the docks, hauling refuse to the dumping pits. The intention was clear: to twist the new sympathy back into revulsion. But the plan's cruelty worked both ways. In the market, people began slipping bread or water to the deep-marked in quiet acts of defiance. At night, strangers would leave small gifts, woolen socks, salted fish, at the thresholds of those shunned. And always, tucked into the offerings, was a strip of blue cloth. The council responded with harsher patrols. Soldiers roamed the streets in pairs, stopping anyone suspected of aiding the marked. A man caught with blue fabric in his possession was beaten in the square until he could not stand. A merchant's stall was overturned when she was seen handing a loaf to a painted youth. Fear returned, but it was a different kind of fear, no longer of the pigment itself, but of the men who wielded it. Mara watched all of this from her exile by the cliff. Her network of allies, though smaller now, still carried word to her. She began sending out more of the dyed cloth strips, but altered, embroidered with tiny white stitches that formed patterns only visible up close. Some were simple wave lines, others spirals, but all held a hidden meaning. "We are still here." The embroidery became a silent rallying point, a sign that those who wore the blue did so by choice, not coercion. The council, in their desperation, made their gravest mistake yet. They ordered the painting of a child. Not a boy grown enough to be accused of theft or defiance, but a girl of barely 10 summers. Her crime was nothing more than refusing to give her uncle's name after he'd been caught aiding the marked. When she was dragged into the square, her small hands clenched into fists, the crowd gasped. The tintmaster dipped his brush, hesitated, then obeyed the order. The cobalt bled across her cheeks like a wound. The silence that followed was not the silence of submission. It was the silence before a storm. Mothers pulled their children close. Men set their jaws. A fisherman in the crowd spat on the cobblestones in the council's direction, and others followed. By nightfall, the council hall found its walls painted, not with pigment from the official stores, but with streaks of blue and crude, defiant lines. Doors, fences, and even fishing boats bore the mark by morning. What had been a quiet undercurrent of resistance was now a visible tide. Elder Harith, standing before the stained walls of the hall, understood the danger. If they could not erase the people's new pride in the color, then the only remaining path was to erase the people themselves who carried it. Plans began to form for mass exiles, sending the most outspoken rebels to the farthest, rockiest islets where survival was uncertain. The island stood on a knife's edge. The blue that once humiliated was now a banner, but the hands that held it trembled with the knowledge that the council's next blow could cut far deeper than pigment. The struggle had moved past meaning. It was now about survival itself. The council's decree came quietly at first, passed in a closed session, and whispered into the ears of loyal enforcers. There would be no public announcement, no show of ceremony, just the silent removal of those deemed the most dangerous to order. The word they used for it was relocation, but everyone who heard it knew the truth: exile. The chosen were to be taken in the night, ferried to the barren outlying islets where wind cut like knives and the soil was little more than salted stone. The first night began under a moon choked by clouds. The rain was light but constant, masking the sound of boots on cobblestones. Small groups of soldiers moved through the alleys, guided by men who knew every house and the names of those within. A sharp knock, a door splintered, and then the dragging of bodies, some still half asleep, others screaming, children clinging to their mothers' legs until pried away. By dawn, whole streets had gaps like missing teeth. Shutters hung open on homes where laughter had once spilled, now eerily silent. Fishing nets lay untended, lines of drying laundry flapped without owners to collect them. The market opened late, its vendors speaking in clipped whispers, eyes darting toward the docks where the exiles had been loaded onto small, unsteady boats. The council expected fear to take root again, but fear did not behave as they had hoped. Instead of silence, the people began to mark the empty homes. At first, it was just a strip of blue cloth tied to a doorframe. Then came painted handprints, palm smears in cobalt, fingerprints trailing down the wood like tears. Neighbors began to care for the abandoned homes, sweeping the steps, leaving small bundles of food inside. In doing so, they kept the exiled present in spirit, as if daring the council to believe they had been truly erased. Mara's role in the resistance shifted. Direct defiance was too visible. The council was watching her too closely. She began to work through intermediaries, fishermen who smuggled messages inside hollowed gourds, weavers who knotted codes into the fringes of shawls, children who carried folded scraps of dyed cloth under their tunics. She knew that without a counter-strategy, the resistance could be broken one boatload at a time. One night, Mara herself slipped into the docks under the cover of darkness. A shipment of prisoners was set to sail at first light. The boats were loaded with sealed crates, supplies for the guards posted on the exile islands. But she and her allies had replaced some of the contents. When the boats reached the rocky shores, the guards would open the crates expecting food and tools, only to find dye pots, brushes, and bolts of blue cloth. A silent weapon, perhaps, but a potent one. The council responded with increased brutality. Soldiers now patrolled in groups of 6, faces hidden behind crude iron masks. Any sign of blue, on a wall, in clothing, in the smallest scrap, was enough to earn arrest. Yet the more they tried to scrub the island clean of the color, the more it returned. It bloomed in hidden corners, in the hems of dresses, on the undersides of fishing nets. The act of wearing it became a quiet rebellion, a vow spoken without sound. But the council's next move was one no one anticipated. They began targeting not only the marked and their families, but anyone whose loyalty was uncertain. It didn't matter if they had worn the color or spoken against the elders. Mere suspicion was enough. The island's population began to thin at a dangerous pace, the docks crowded with more exiles each week. In the flickering firelight of the Resistance's meeting place, Mara spread a rough map of the archipelago across a table. "If we do nothing," she told the gathered few, "there will be no one left to fight." Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of inevitability. She proposed something daring, intercepting the exile boats themselves. It was dangerous, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only way to bring back those taken and show the council that even the sea could not sever the bonds of the painted people. The room was silent for a long time. Then, one by one, the heads around the table began to nod. The next battle would not be fought in the market or in the council hall. It would be fought on the open water, where the blue of the rebels' pigment would blend with the endless blue of the sea. The tide of the conflict was turning, but whether it would rise in triumph or drown them all remained uncertain. The sea was black glass under the new moon, reflecting nothing but the faint smear of stars above. In the harbor, the exile boats rocked gently against their moorings, each guarded by a handful of armed sentries. The plan had been studied for weeks. Every current, every moon phase, every gap in the patrol's rhythm. But now, standing in the prow of her small craft, Mara felt the weight of 1,000 unknowns pressing on her chest. The Resistance had no ships fit for battle. Their fleet was a patchwork of stolen fishing skiffs and repaired hulls, each painted a dull gray to vanish into the darkness. The only thing that united them was the mark each bore on the underside of its prow, a handprint in blue, pressed so deep into the wood that no wave could erase it. They pushed off silently, or slipping into the water without a splash. The air smelled of salt and tar, with the faint copper tang of dye lingering from the hidden cargo they carried. The plan was simple but perilous. Intercept the exile boats before they cleared the outer reef, overpower the guards, and spirit the prisoners away before the council could respond. Failure meant not only capture but public execution, painted blue, paraded through the market, and cast into the sea as a warning. The first target was a broad-bellied cargo vessel loaded with both supplies and prisoners. As Mara's skiff drew alongside, two shadows rose from the deck, their voices low but questioning. Mara's heart hammered. Then, in a blur, her crew was up and over the rail. Knives flashed, muffled shouts were swallowed by the crash of waves against the hull, and within moments the guards lay bound, faces pressed to the deck. Below, the prisoners sat in cramped rows, hands tied, eyes wide with disbelief. When the first one recognized Mara, a murmur rippled through them, half hope, half fear. "We have no time," she whispered. "Move." Her crew cut bonds, passed out scraps of cloth to muffle chains, and began loading the exiles into the skiffs. Every minute they lingered increased the risk of discovery. By the time the last prisoner was pulled aboard, a sharp cry rang out from the shoreline. Torches flared to life along the docks. The council's sentries had seen them. The quiet tide of escape turned instantly into a desperate race. The Resistance scattered, each skiff darting into the maze of reefs and shoals that ringed the island. The moon emerged briefly, silvering the water and revealing the outlines of pursuers, sleek patrol boats with stronger oarsmen and sharper hulls. Mara's skiff skimmed dangerously close to the coral, the hull scraping rock just enough to make her wince. Behind her, a pursuing boat closed the distance. An arrow hissed past her ear, vanishing into the dark. She barked an order, and her crew shifted their weight, sending the skiff into a sharp turn that would have capsized a less practiced team. The patrol boat overshot, crashing into a reef with a sound like splintering bone. Mara didn't look back. Hours later, the fugitives huddled on a deserted crescent of sand on a neighboring islet. There were no huts here, no fresh water, only the sound of waves and the flicker of a small, carefully shielded fire. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was freedom for one more night. As dawn bled into the sky, Mara walked the shoreline, watching the tide carry faint streaks of blue pigment from the rebels' hidden cloth into the surf. It was a strange sight, the color of shame, once forced upon them, now staining the ocean itself. She wondered if the council could see it from the main island, if they realized the color was slipping from their control and spreading, like a tide that could not be held back. But victory was never without a shadow. Not all the skiffs had returned. 2 had been overtaken, their crews and passengers dragged back to the docks in chains. Mara knew the council would not waste time. The reprisals would be swift and brutal. Still, she could not ignore what they had accomplished. For the first time, the exile boats had not sailed unopposed. For the first time, the sea itself had been claimed by the painted people. And now, somewhere in the heart of the council's fortress, fear was beginning to whisper. The council did not wait for the salt to dry on their wounds. By the second sunrise after the painted fleet's daring raid, the island's central square had been transformed into a stage of retribution. Word spread faster than the morning tide, guards banging on shutters, messengers pounding on doors, herding the citizens toward the plaza. The air was tense, thick with the low murmurs of people who suspected what was coming but dared not say it aloud. When the crowd assembled, the counselors appeared in their ceremonial black robes, the morning light glinting off the bronze sigils clasped at their throats. They stood in a line, flanked by guards whose spears were tipped not with steel, but with brushes dripping blue pigment. Behind them, the prisoners taken in the failed rescue, the missing skiffs from Mara's fleet, were bound and kneeling. This was not the blue the people knew. The pigment had been altered, deepened to a hue so dark it seemed almost black, catching the light only in fleeting ripples. Whispers ran through the crowd. It was said to be mixed with crushed lapis from the mountains, a luxury material reserved for sacred iconography. The council's intent was clear. If the painted blue had once been a mark of shame, now it would be elevated to an indelible brand of terror. One by one, the prisoners were lifted to their feet and stripped to the waist. The guards worked quickly, brushing the thickened pigment across their faces, shoulders, and hands in deliberate, ritualized strokes. Each movement was slow, methodical, as if to etch the punishment into memory as much as into skin. When the final line was drawn across a prisoner's brow, the crowd gasped, not for the act itself, which they had seen before, but for the pigment's strange quality. It did not drip or flake. It clung to the skin as though it had been poured from the night sky itself. The council's high orator stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd like a wave. This is the mark of those who defy the order of the island. It is the mark of chaos, of lawlessness, of treachery. Let it remind you that the tide which carries them away will return to drag them under. At the signal, the prisoners were led away, not to the harbor, as tradition dictated, but toward the inland marshes, a place few ventured willingly. Stories of that place were older than the council itself, of quagmire that could swallow a man whole, of reeds that whispered curses at night, of water so still it reflected nothing. It was a punishment meant not just to kill, but to erase. From her hiding place among the upper balconies, Mara watched the procession wind through the streets. Her fists clenched at the sight of her comrades, their heads high despite the pigment that gleamed on their skin. She had known the risks of the rescue mission. She had not imagined this. In the days that followed, the new blue became an omnipresent specter. The council ordered that anyone found aiding rebels would be marked, not necessarily exiled, but forced to live under the gaze of neighbors who now looked at them with fear, pity, or contempt. The pigment did not fade. Some whispered it could not be scrubbed away at all, that it bound itself to the skin like a curse. Whether the alchemy behind it was real or not, the effect was devastating. Shops closed their doors to the marked. Children crossed the street to avoid them. The blue became a wall between the punished and the rest of the island, sealing them in a prison without bars. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. For the resistance, this was a turning point. No longer could they operate in the shadows with the comfort of anonymity. Every failed strike, every captured member risked not only death, but the permanent fracturing of their families and communities. The blue would linger, a living warning. Mara convened her closest allies in a hidden cavern beneath the southern cliffs. The air was damp, the sound of waves echoing through the stone. They spoke in low, urgent voices about the pigment, how it was made, where the lapis was mined, who might be bribed or coerced into betraying the formula. If they could steal it, they could turn it into a weapon of their own, or perhaps find a way to dissolve it entirely. But another idea took root in Mara's mind, dangerous and defiant. What if they embraced the blue? What if they wore it not as a mark of shame, but as a banner of defiance? If the council wanted to control the color, the resistance could flood the island with it until it meant not punishment, but pride. It was a gamble that could break them completely, or ignite something unstoppable. That night, as she sat alone at the mouth of the cavern, watching the moon spill silver over the water, Mara dipped her fingers into a pouch of stolen pigment. She smeared it across her own cheek in a bold, jagged stroke. The color glowed faintly in the moonlight. For the first time, she felt the blue was hers. The decision came to Mara not in a blaze of inspiration, but in the slow, heavy rhythm of sleepless nights. For days she had watched the council's new blue spread across the island like an infection, marking prisoners, shaming sympathizers, eroding trust between neighbors. She had seen children point at the marked and laugh, their parents pulling them away with whispers that stung sharper than the jeers. She had heard shopkeepers hiss refusals, had watched doors slam in the faces of men and women who had once been pillars of the community. And in all of it, she saw the council's true power, not in their soldiers, nor in their laws, but in their ability to turn a single color into a curse. Her plan was both absurd and impossible, which was exactly why it might work. If the blue was to become a badge of disgrace, she would make it so common, so deliberately worn, that it lost all meaning as punishment. The council could not shame 100 or 1,000 if all of them bore the mark by choice. It would happen in the marketplace, at dusk, when the narrow streets glowed gold from the sinking sun and the scent of roasting fish drifted from the cooking stalls. That was when the island gathered, traders, farmers, fishermen, gossip-mongers, and thieves, shoulder to shoulder in a living tide of barter and banter. And that was when Mara would strike. The cavern beneath the southern cliffs became the staging ground. Resistance members sat in a circle, jars of the stolen pigment laid before them, each sealed tight against the damp. The pigment was thick and strange to the touch, grainy from the powdered lapis, smelling faintly of brine and something acrid, vinegar, perhaps, or some coastal plant boiled into the mix. Mara showed them how to apply it, not in the clean, precise strokes of the council's punishment, but in fierce, jagged streaks across the cheeks, the brow, the forearms. They were not to hide it or soften it. This was war paint. Some in the group were afraid. To wear the blue was to invite exile, or worse. But Mara's voice cut through their hesitation. They want us to fear the mark. We will make them fear its spread. We will make them chase us. And when they see the blue on every face, they will know they have already lost. On the chosen night, the resistance melted into the crowd. The marketplace was alive with sound, vendors calling prices, coins clinking, gulls shrieking overhead. The smell of salt and spice mingled with the sharp tang of smoke from oil lamps. At first, the blue appeared in small flashes, a single merchant with a slash across his jaw, a boy darting between stalls with his forehead streaked, a fishmonger casually applying it to her arms as if it were no more remarkable than drying her hands. Then the spread began. The resistance moved from person to person, pressing small daubs of pigment into willing palms. "Wear it," they whispered. "For your brother, for your neighbor, for yourself." Some hesitated. Others dipped their fingers without a word. Within minutes, the blue was blooming across the marketplace like a strange, defiant tide. On bakers, on porters, on old women hunched over baskets of herbs. Even children took it, smearing it in messy, laughing strokes, unafraid. From the council's balcony above the square, the guards noticed too late. At first they thought it a mockery, a handful of fools courting punishment. But as the crowd shifted and turned, the setting sun caught on hundreds of painted faces, and the truth struck like a hammer blow. This was no mockery. This was a reclaiming. The high orator appeared, flanked by guards, his voice cutting through the noise. "Cease this at once. This is the mark of the condemned." His words only seemed to spur the crowd. Someone began to chant, low at first, then swelling until it rolled through the square in waves. It was not a word Mara recognized, but it carried the cadence of defiance, and that was enough. The guards moved in, but the marketplace was a sea of bodies. To seize one painted face meant seizing them all, and the crowd closed around the resistance like a living shield. Mara slipped between them, her own face streaked deep blue, the pigment catching the light like steel. She locked eyes with a council guard for a heartbeat, a look not of fear, but of promise. By the time the sun dipped fully into the horizon, the blue was everywhere. It clung to skin, to clothing, even to the worn stones beneath their feet where hands had dipped and painted the earth itself. The pigment, once a weapon of humiliation, had become something else entirely, a declaration that the council could not own a symbol without the people's consent. That night, when Mara returned to the cavern, her hands still stained, she knew the battle ahead would be harder than any before. But for the first time in weeks, she also knew they had shifted the tide. The blue was no longer just theirs, it belonged to the island. And the council would have to reckon with that. The morning after the marketplace rebellion, the island awoke to a silence that felt unnatural. The gulls still cried, the waves still struck the shore, but in the streets there was none of the usual clatter of carts or the familiar hum of gossip. Doors stayed shut, shutters latched, as if the entire city was holding its breath. The pigment had not yet faded from the skin of those who had worn it. In some places it had been smeared onto walls, doors, and even the great stone steps of the council hall. What had begun as a punishment now looked like a flag unfurled across the island. The council, humiliated, convened in secret. In their chambers, high-ceilinged and echoing, their walls hung with the faded banners of older, prouder days. The High Order and his closest advisors pored over reports from the guards. By their count, over a third of the island's visible populace had been seen wearing the blue. If this spread unchecked, the punishment would be meaningless. Without fear, their rule would crumble. Their decision was swift and merciless. An emergency decree was passed. Anyone found bearing the blue, whether as punishment or by choice, would be considered an active dissenter and subject to immediate arrest. Merchants caught selling pigment would face the destruction of their stalls and the confiscation of their goods. Even the possession of blue pigment, without official purpose, would be grounds for imprisonment. And in the most chilling clause, the council granted the guards full discretion in carrying out these orders, an open invitation to brutality. By midday, the streets trembled under the boots of the guard patrols. They moved not in twos or threes, but in phalanxes, shields overlapping, truncheons ready. The first arrests were swift and public. A fisherman still streaked from the night before dragged from his boat. An elderly woman stripped of her shawl to reveal blue-painted arms. A group of children, faces still smudged, seized and marched away while their mothers screamed. The pigment was scraped from walls, banners hung over graffiti, but the faint stains on the stone told their own story, marks that could not be washed away entirely. Mara watched from a shadowed alley, her jaw tight, as two guards overturned a market cart in search of pigment jars. The merchant begged, swore he had none, but they found a small pot beneath a sack of grain and smashed it against the cobblestones before beating him senseless. It was clear now that the council meant to drown this defiance in fear before it could grow further roots. But fear is a strange thing. It can scatter, or it can harden. In the hidden rooms of taverns and the candle-lit corners of workshops, those who had painted themselves the night before gathered again. Their talk was no longer of symbols alone, but of open defiance. The blue had been claimed. Now the question was how to defend it. Plans emerged for safe houses, for smuggling pigment in disguised containers, for sending runners to outlying villages to spread the act of painting far beyond the council's immediate reach. One story began to circulate, a rumor, perhaps invented by the resistance itself, that the pigment the council used for its punishment came from an ancient mine, deep in the cliffs, where the stone was stained blue by the bones of those buried there centuries ago. The tale claimed the color was not a mark of shame at all, but one of honor, carried from a forgotten people who had resisted the first rulers of the island. Whether true or not, the story caught fire. Now to wear the blue was not only to defy the council, but to invoke the ghosts of those who had died for freedom. The council responded by tightening its chokehold. They established cleansing stations in every district, forcing the painted to scrub themselves raw under the eyes of guards. Those who refused were stripped in the streets, their pigment scraped away with rags soaked in vinegar and salt. The stench clung to the air, a mix of humiliation and chemical sting. Yet in the evenings, the paint would reappear, bold and fresh, as if the act of erasing it had only made the color stronger. By the week's end, the island was divided not just in loyalty, but in geography. Some districts were heavily patrolled, their streets eerily bare of blue. Others had become strongholds of resistance, where the pigment was worn openly and patrols entered only in force. Mara moved between them like a shadow, carrying jars wrapped in oilcloth, whispering news from one end of the island to the other. She knew the council's retaliation had made their struggle harder, but also more inevitable. In the quiet of the cavern, she addressed the resistance. They think the blue is still theirs to control, but every time they strip it from our skin, we will put it back. Every arrest will be met with 2 more faces painted. If they want to fight a color, let them fight the sea itself. Outside, the sound of boots striking cobblestones echoed down the narrow streets. The night of painted faces had been a beginning, but this was the start of the war. The first blood of the Blue Rebellion was spilled on a morning that began with sunlight slanting through the narrow lanes of the harbor district, warm and deceptively calm. By midday, the cobblestones ran slick with something far darker. For days, the council's forces had pushed deeper into the resistance's strongholds, their boots hammering through alleys, their batons cracking against shutters, their voices barking orders like iron striking iron. Yet until now, the movement had kept its defiance largely symbolic. Paint on skin, pigment scrawled on walls, silent processions through the markets. It was an unspoken rule among the painted. The blue would speak without blades. But repression has a way of breaking the rules it fears most. The spark came when a patrol of 8 guards, led by a captain known for his cruelty, cornered a group of young apprentices in the tanner's quarter. They had been smuggling small jars of pigment inside hollowed-out loaves of bread, passing them through the district under the guise of delivering meals to the poor. When the guards demanded to search their bundles, one boy, barely more than 15, tried to run. The captain caught him by the hair, slammed him against a wall, and in full view of the street, slit the jar open over his head. The blue cascaded down the boy's face like a mockery of baptism. The crowd gasped. Then the captain's blade came down again, this time across the boy's cheek. The sound was sharp, the spray of blood shocking against the pigment. The boy collapsed. Something broke in that moment, not just in the boy's body, but in the crowd. A woman screamed, and a stallholder hurled a wooden mallet at the guards. In an instant, the air turned electric with fury. Men and women surged forward, some armed with nothing more than broom handles, others with knives snatched from their stalls. The guards drew steel, but the narrow street worked against them. The fight was close and desperate, the kind where rage turns fear into something lethal. Mara was 2 streets away when the shouting began. She ran toward it, her mind already knowing what she would find. By the time she arrived, the fight was a blur of motion. Blue-smeared arms grappling with armored bodies, the flash of steel, the dull thud of wood against bone. The boy lay crumpled near the wall, and without thinking, Mara pulled him into the shelter of a doorway. He was alive, barely, his breath ragged, his face a mask of blue and crimson. She pressed her hand against his wound, her own arms streaked with the mingled colors. By the time the guards broke free and retreated, 2 of them were down, one unmoving, another clutching a shattered arm. The resistance had suffered more, 3 dead, 5 badly injured, the boy among them. But the fight had lit something fierce and unstoppable. That evening, word spread faster than the council could contain it. The painted had struck back. The council's response was immediate and ruthless. Martial law was declared. Any assembly of more than 3 people could be dispersed by force. Curfews were enforced with the crack of whips. Patrols doubled, checkpoints sprang up on every major street, and the harbor gates were locked. Food prices soared as merchants feared to move their goods. The island began to suffocate under its own fear. Yet the blue did not fade. In fact, it deepened. In mourning, the painted began to add a second stripe, red over blue, honoring those who had fallen. Walls were tagged not only with the defiant swath of pigment, but with the names of the dead, written large enough to be seen from the council steps. The color had evolved, no longer merely a mark of shame reclaimed, but now a banner of vengeance. In the shadows of the old salt warehouses, Mara and the core of the resistance met to decide their next steps. The mood was heavier now. The rebellion had crossed a threshold, Blood had been spilled, and there was no going back to pain alone. Some argued for armed resistance, for turning the pigment caravans into weapon supply lines. Others, fearing the council's military strength, urged patience and subversion, claiming that a slow erosion of the regime would save more lives. Mara listened, silent, her fingers idly tracing a smear of blue on the table before her. Finally, she spoke. "We can't let the blood dry without consequence," she said. "If they think they can kill us without cost, they will keep killing." The blue was a message. Now it is a weapon. We must learn to wield it. Plans shifted that night. Instead of open marches, the painted began to work in coordinated strikes, cutting supply lines to the garrisons, sabotaging guard outposts, ambushing lone patrols in the twisting alleys where the armor slowed them. And in every skirmish, the blue appeared, on the fighter's skin, on the walls nearby, even smeared across the shields of fallen guards as a sign of defiance. The council realized too late that their attempt to crush the rebellion had forged it into something harder, sharper. They had wanted the streets cleared of blue. Instead, they found them streaked with a new, terrible color, one that could not be washed away by vinegar or law. The island was no longer divided into zones of loyalty and defiance. Now it was a battlefield, and every street corner was a front. From the northern slopes of the island, Azure Hill had always been more symbol than stronghold, a cluster of stone houses and terraced gardens built along the highest rise near the harbor. In peaceful times, its name came from the clear view of the sea and the way the sky blazed blue above it. Now, in the months after the blood in the streets, it had become something else entirely, a fortress of the painted, a beacon visible from nearly every quarter. Its walls, once pale with lime wash, had been covered in sweeping strokes of pigment. Blue banners snapped in the wind from every rooftop. Even at night, the glow of oil lamps picked out the shimmer of color, like a constant reminder that the rebellion lived and that it was watching. The council could not allow such defiance to stand. Rumors swirled that Azure Hill housed the resistance's leaders, that it was a stockpile for food, weapons, and, most dangerously, pigment. In truth, it was all of these things. Mara had moved her operations there weeks before, knowing the council would eventually come. It was not arrogance, but inevitability. The hill was both their shield and their challenge to the world below. At dawn on the first day of the siege, the sound of drums rolled up the slope, followed by the glint of spears and the black gleam of the council guards' armor. They came in disciplined ranks, their faces hidden behind visors, the sun catching the edges of their shields. The people of Azure Hill had prepared barricades of overturned carts, stacks of sandbags, walls reinforced with planks and scrap iron. Narrow alleys were blocked with bricked archways that left only thin openings for arrows or stones. The first assault came swiftly. The guards advanced in a tight wedge, shields interlocked, pushing up the steep main road toward the upper terraces. Rocks and shards of pottery rained down from the rooftops, shouts echoing against the stone. Pigment bombs. Ceramic jars filled with powdered blue mixed with lime were hurled into the ranks, bursting in clouds that clung to armor and skin. The guards pressed on, coughing, their black uniforms now streaked with the mark they had tried to erase from the city. Mara watched from the high steps of the old granary, directing runners to shift fighters where the line buckled. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the acrid tang of burning pitch from torches hurled into the street. Twice, the guards reached the second terrace, only to be driven back by a sudden counterattack from side alleys they thought abandoned. Every retreat was met with jeers, drums pounding a slow, mocking rhythm. By the third day, the council had changed tactics. They cut off the water channels feeding the hill, hoping thirst would force surrender. The wells ran dry, and the people rationed what little remained, dipping from rain barrels and melting small caches of ice hoarded in cellars. Food grew scarce, though still the banners flew. Children carried slings instead of stones now, flinging handfuls of pigment when no arrows were left. Even the elders took shifts on the barricades, their wrinkled arms steady as they passed ammunition or shouted warnings from the rooftops. At night, the siege took on a quieter menace. Patrols of guards circled the base of the hill, torches flickering in the dark, their chants carrying upward in deliberate intimidation. Fires were set to the lower houses, sending plumes of smoke curling into the sky. In answer, the resistance lit their own signal fires, casting a strange glow across the pigment-covered walls. The blue seemed almost alive in the firelight, deepening to an oceanic darkness that made the hill feel like a ship adrift on a black sea. On the sixth day, Mara knew the breaking point was close. The council had brought siege engines, crude battering rams mounted on wheels, shielded by wet hides to resist fire. These they rolled toward the main gates at first light, their thundering blows shaking the timbers. The defenders hurled everything they had left, pots of boiling brine, rocks pried from the garden terraces, even the last reserves of pigment mixed with sand to blind the attackers. But the gates groaned and splintered. Then came the moment that would enter the island's whispered history. As the gates finally gave way and the guards surged forward, the defenders unveiled their last weapon, a massive cistern hidden beneath the granary steps, filled not with water, but with pigment slurry, thick and sticky. It was loosed down the slope in a sudden, viscous flood. The front ranks of the guards were swept off their feet, their armor instantly coated in a brilliant, choking blue. They flailed and fell, their weapons slipping from their hands, the hill's steep incline turning the pigment into a river that dragged them back toward the base. The counterattack came not with swords, but with sound. The painted poured down from the terraces, shouting, drumming, clanging pots and lids, driving the humiliated guards into full retreat. By dusk, Azure Hill still stood, battered but unbroken. The council's troops withdrew to their encampments, their armor stained in a way no amount of scrubbing could erase. The siege had failed, at least for now, but Mara knew this was only the beginning. Azure Hill had survived, but its defense had cost dearly. The wells were empty, the stores nearly gone, and too many fighters lay wounded. Yet something deeper had been gained. Word of the siege spread across the island, and in every quarter, the blue began to reappear, not just on faces, but painted in bold swathes across doors, market stalls, even the council's own walls. The hill had become more than a fortress. It was now the heart of the island's defiance, and its survival told every painted soul that victory, however distant, was possible. The failure to take Azure Hill had shaken the council in ways no outsider could see. Behind the closed doors of their marbled hall, voices rose and fell in sharp bursts, their arguments heavy with fear disguised as anger. The banners of blue spreading across the city were no longer just an eyesore. They were an infection, creeping from wall to wall, street to street. If left unchecked, the council's power would rot from the inside. They needed something decisive, something so ruthless it would not only crush the rebellion, but erase its very memory. It was Councillor Taryn, the youngest and most cunning of them, who proposed the plan. "Strike at the roots," he said, his voice cold. "Not the fighters. They are many and replaceable. Strike where the pigment is born." Pigment. That was the rebellion's lifeblood. It stained their skin, their clothes, their walls. It was the symbol they carried like a second flag, and without it, they were just people again, people the council could control. For weeks, council spies had traced every shipment of blue powder, every hidden cache. They found the mountain streams where mineral-rich silt was gathered, the backroom mills where it was ground to dust, the safe houses where jars were stored before being carried to the hill. Now, the council meant to burn them all in one night. They called it Operation Clean Sky. To the outside, it would appear as a simple campaign against illegal trade. In truth, it was designed to be a scorched earth assault. Squads were sent in silence, spreading through the city in the hours before dawn. Doors were kicked in, pigments seized and smashed in the street. Mills were torched, their grinding stones shattered with sledgehammers. Entire blocks smelled of burning lime and wet ash. But it was not enough to destroy the supplies. They had to make the pigment dangerous to use. So they tainted what they could not burn. Council chemists mixed a fine dust of ground glass into the stolen pigment before it was returned to lure the rebellion into poisoning itself. It was the kind of cruelty only those far removed from bloodshed could devise. On Azure Hill, the news came in fragments. Runners arrived gasping with reports of fires near the river mills, of smoke rising in the West Market, of armed patrols moving faster than anyone could follow. By sunrise, Marin knew the scope of it. The rebellion's pigment stores had been cut in half in a single night. Worse, she could not be certain which remaining caches were safe. One mistake could maim her own fighters. The hill fell into a grim silence. Even the drums ceased. Children who had once splashed each other with streaks of blue now sat with clean faces, their laughter stilled. The banners still flew, but they were faded from weeks of sun and rain, and no new ones could be made without risking poisoned pigment. The council seized on the moment. They marched squads into neighborhoods once loyal to the rebellion, their boots grinding over the cracked blue paint on the stones. They offered amnesty to anyone who would renounce the pigment and swear loyalty. The threat was unspoken but clear. Keep your walls clean, or they will burn. Mara met with her lieutenants in the shadow of the granary. Some urged caution, a temporary withdrawal until new pigment could be made. Others demanded a counterstrike before fear took root. It was Elder Ishan, oldest among them, who broke the deadlock. "They have struck at our symbol," he said, his voice rasping but sure. "So we must strike at theirs." The council's own crest, a sunburst of gold over white, was carved above every public building, painted on every banner, stamped into the coins that passed from hand to hand. It was their claim to divinity, to the right to rule. Ishan's proposal was simple: deface it everywhere, all at once, in a single night. Even without blue pigment, they could use soot, mud, blood, anything that would mar that perfect golden face. The plan spread like fire in dry grass. The rebellion's fighters moved under the cover of darkness, slipping past patrols, carrying sacks of charcoal and brushes cut from broom bristles. By dawn, the sunbursts were gone, scrubbed away, painted over, or smeared until they looked like a dying ember. The council awoke to a city that no longer bore their mark. Even those who feared the rebellion could see the change, could feel that the council's grip had loosened. The blue was gone from many streets, but defiance still lingered in the air. And then came the final blow to Operation Clean Sky. Days later, in the high terraces of Azure Hill, a boy appeared in the marketplace holding a jar of deep, untainted blue pigment. No one knew where it had come from, but the color was unmistakable, vivid as the sky after rain. Within hours, it had been divided into dozens of smaller jars, passed from hand to hand until it was everywhere at once. Mara stood on the granary steps as the first streaks reappeared on cheeks and walls. "They thought they could take the sky from us," she said to the gathered crowd. But the sky was never theirs to give. The council had played its last gambit and failed. Now, with the people's faith restored and the blue once more in their grasp, the rebellion was ready to move from defense to open war. The final chapter was about to be written, and the ink would be pigment, blood, and the unyielding will of a city that had refused to bow. When the last council edict was torn from the city's walls and trampled in the dust, the streets exhaled. For years they had lived under the weight of decrees, patrols, and the constant reminder that their bodies, their skin, their very image belonged to the rulers. But now, the paint was back in their hands, and with it came the strange, electric freedom of deciding how they would be seen. The rebellion's banners no longer needed to be bright or even uniform. Some were hastily brushed, others carefully patterned, but each was alive with intent. Historians would later argue over the meaning of the blue punishment that had started it all. Was it rooted in some ancient superstition, a relic of old maritime justice, a tool of shame that had been twisted into defiance? No answer was certain, and perhaps that was the point. The truth had been drowned in centuries of retelling, in the smoke of burned records, in the whispers of prisoners who never walked free again. What mattered was not the origin, but the transformation, how something meant to diminish had been claimed and made whole. The council's power did not collapse in a single night. It withered, piece by piece, as trade routes slipped from their grasp, as city guards quietly ignored orders, as neighborhoods repainted their walls in daylight instead of darkness. The blue, once feared, became a kind of civic birthright. Children born in the years after the uprising had never known a world without it, and when told of the punishment, they laughed as though hearing of a myth too foolish to believe. In the ruins of the old council hall, left untouched as a reminder, there still hung a faded sunburst crest, its gold dulled to the color of tarnished brass. Someone, at some forgotten moment, had drawn a streak of blue through its center. Rain had blurred the line over the seasons, but it remained, stubborn against the weather, as if the city itself refused to let the mark be washed away. The island's story spread far beyond its shores. Sailors carried it to ports where blue pigment was rare and precious, and the tale mingled with local legends until it became its own mythology. In distant taverns, drinkers told of a place where humiliation had been turned inside out, where shame had been reforged into pride. And in that retelling, the island became less a location and more an idea, a reminder that symbols are not fixed things. They are living, and in the hands of those who suffer under them, they can be remade. There would be other tyrannies, other punishments, other attempts to brand people against their will. But the lesson of the blue endured, that identity, once claimed, is not easily stolen back, that a people who paint themselves in defiance cannot be forced to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressor. It was a truth the council had learned too late, that control over bodies is nothing if you cannot control the meaning those bodies carry. And so the color remained. In festival and mourning, in victory and loss, in the quiet days when the sea was calm and the markets full. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was theirs. In the end, the islanders did not win because they fought harder or planned better, but because they understood the most dangerous thing in the world is not rebellion itself, but the moment when people realize they no longer need permission to be seen.